So I'm going to cover the informational interview, what it is, and how you might use it in not only in job search, but also in career exploration, and then how to prepare for informational interviews. The last thing we'll cover is questions that you might want to ask your interviewee, and then Q&A. So basically, this is what an informational interview is. It's a way that you, as a prospective job seeker, will actually interview a professional about either sometimes a specific job, sometimes like the broader career field or profession, sometimes an industry, and then it might be specific to an organization or company. And of course, these things can overlap. You know, it might be that you're conducting an informational interview not only about an industry, but also, you know, gee, I heard that Intel hires people who do qualitative research. Can you tell me about that? And then can you also tell me about your job? Okay, so that's the way in which it might work. So the purpose is really twofold. On one level, you're exploring a career, job, or organization. So on one level, it's a research tool. It's about gathering information. But the second purpose, and this is the one that I think is over the long haul most beneficial, it's building your network. You know, because these are people that, when you think of it in the panel, the speakers today who said, start with us, come up and get our business card. That's an example of how you begin engaging with people to build your network, and you can do that with informational interviews as well. So here's an example of a use of skills transfer. So on the Berkeley campus, I should say, we're different in that we don't say teaching assistant, we say graduate student instructor, and I think everywhere else it's you use TAs, right, as the terminology, is that correct? Yeah. So this is a graduate student who is in, or was in French literature PhD program. She loved teaching, knew for a variety of reasons that she did not want or wasn't focused on an academic career, but wanted to use her teaching skills in a new field. So I encouraged her to go out and do informational interviews. So she used it to identify, you know, what she might need to learn, like what gaps there were either in her experience, her industry knowledge, and so forth. One of the things that she did was to go to a meeting of a professional association and found out about a contract job. So ASTD, they've recently slightly changed their acronym to ATD, but this is the major professional body of people who do training and development in industry. So if you look at the jobs, they're essentially using the same skills that most of you use on a daily basis. Teaching, curriculum design, consultation, but they're using them usually in industry or government. And so the terminology is somewhat different, and there might be some differences in terms of software that's used or some other, again, areas like gaps in knowledge or experience. But for the most part, the key skills are really the same skills. So she got a contract job through this network, found out that she really liked it, and eventually that led to a full-time position with that same firm. Okay, so here's an example of where you might start. So whatever you're interested in, usually there is a professional body, a professional association. In many fields, there's several, like maybe there are 2 to 3 major national associations. Sometimes there's just one. But that's the kind of thing that you find out through the informational interview. What kind of professional associations do you belong to? Or what are the local level professional associations in this field? So sometimes the idea is to find out about the national association and then kind of drill down to regional, state, to local. So with ASTD, we're in the Bay Area, so the Bay Area has several chapters. There is a San Francisco chapter, which is called the Golden Gate chapter. There's a Silicon Valley, and then there's also an East Bay chapter. So the local level professional societies is really where you want to go, particularly if you are networking in order to find a job in that location. Because that's where people exchange all sorts of information about, what's available. So here's an example. Oops. Oh, does it have the? I was looking for the little red light spot to highlight it, but this is, you can see where the arrow is. This is one of the talks, increase your contact speed networking. Okay, so that's actually a topic for people in that professional group. And so I'm sure that at that speed networking event, a lot of people were going there not just for the membership, not just because they belong, but also because maybe they are actually in a job search mode themselves, even though they're a member of that organization. So that's an example of how you can look at the website of the professional associations, get a sense of what the issues and trends are, the topics, the involvement opportunities. And so that's one of the quickest ways to segue or to fast track into a new field, is to find out, where do the professionals hang out? What's the watering hole of the professionals in that field? Because that's where you meet people. It's also where you find out about what the challenges are. What's the current state of the art in this field? What are some of the issues and trends? And you can find that information much quicker than by just reading and researching about it, when you're talking directly with people who are engaged in that field. So, getting inside the organization. Here's another example of a PhD that I worked with. So he's on the job market, and he actually had already had an initial interview with this company that was his top choice. He had a list of 10 places that he might want to work in the local area, and this was the one where he said, I'd really love to work with these people. So using LinkedIn and using it the right way, meaning, you know how you get all those invites to connect with people that you don't know, and you don't know why they want you to connect? And that's not really how it was meant to be used. He's actually using it the way it was meant to be used. So he asked for a referral because he was maybe 3 contacts removed from that person who was in that company. And so he asked for the referral, that person referred him to the next person, and then he got in touch with the person in that company, went to the office, did an informational interview, and basically focused on what was going on in the company currently, and a little, some questions about the organizational culture. And so what's interesting about this is that he didn't talk with someone who was in his area. That person worked in a different area of the company. However, that meeting was instrumental in informing how he talked about his skills, because a couple weeks later, he was called back for a second interview, so he's a finalist at this stage. He ended up getting the job. So here's an instance where that networking, the informational interview, was really key, or it played a part in him being selected for the position, because it was really clear to the interviewers that he'd done his homework. He wasn't just another bright person who knew his field but was clueless about the company. It was like he had sort of a bit of an inside track. And so that's how you can use it when you're a job seeker. And I think the way that people sometimes think about networking is that if I can only talk to the hiring manager, if I can only talk to the person who has the power to, connect me to someone else who's at that level. But here, the power is really in connecting with people in the organization, because it brings you a knowledge base, it brings you information, rather than putting you in touch with people who are the key influencers. Because it doesn't always happen that way. But you can see that this was valuable information. So where do you find contacts? You generate a list of people that you know. Former graduate students, people in the cohort group who graduated 2 or 3 years before you, or 2 or 3 years ago, and you're still in touch with them, or you have their contact information, you lost touch, get back in touch with that person. Friends, faculty members from your undergrad institutions. Sometimes, very often, people come from undergrad institutions that have very strong alumni networks. That's something that, often it's an untapped resource. So go back and contact those people. Company literature or brochures. Sometimes you get the names of people by looking at the bios in that section of the website that says about us, or our people, or our team. And then you see that, this person went to UCLA too, or this person, there's some common ground that you share, and that perhaps you might want to contact them to see if you can do an informational interview. LinkedIn, Facebook, newspaper articles, former employers, relatives, friends of families, happenstance, 6 degrees of separation, the whole thing of us all being connected that way. We're on our campus, as I think many of the UC campuses, we do various sorts of career conferences for PhDs. So 1 year, our PhD career colloquium featured the theme of networking. So we brought in a keynote speaker who talked about networking, how you can use networking in everyday life. And we decided to do an interactive activity where we had tables of 6, and we deliberately mixed people up by disciplines so that, all the scientists weren't sitting together, all the humanists weren't sitting together. We really mixed people up for this activity. And so the task was for each person to say what kind of job they were interested in, what field they were interested in, and to ask at the table, does anyone have any leads? And this was a very powerful exercise, because we found that a lot of people were sharing. And then each of us on the organizing committee would sit at a table. And so the table where I was sitting, people were exchanging information. When we got to the 6th person, he said, well, I doubt that anyone has any information that would be useful for me, because I'm literally a rocket scientist. I'm a physicist, and so, I do, and of course, mind you, we're sitting at a table full of people from all disciplines except rocket science. So one person who actually, interestingly enough, was a humanities PhD student, said, actually, my housemate is interning at NASA right now, and I'm sure that she would be glad to speak with you about working with that organization. So that's another way in which, when it comes to networking, 6 degrees of separation, you cannot presume how people are connected to one another. You can't presume that someone doesn't have contacts, because very often they do. Very often it's the people that where you might think, this person has the most spurious relationship to what I do, but that might be the very person that has information that's useful. So that's why cast a wide net when it comes to making a list of your contacts. Introduce yourself, okay? So you tell how you know that person, if it's a referral, my cousin, my neighbor, who is it, who referred you to them. Mention any kind of shared connections or interests. Yeah, I noticed that, you're working on a project in this area. Some of my dissertation overlaps with it. Talk about things that you might commonly be interested in. Give them a brief summary of your work, your interests, and then talk about why you think they might be helpful to them. Very often people want to be helpful, but if it's just a vague sort of, hey, tell me what it's like to work here, versus I have some specific questions that will help me to, decide on a direction, and they're in the area of organizational culture, how people progress through the organization. So you might have some specific topics in mind already that you think they could be helpful with. So the more clarity you have about that, the more helpful they can be. Request the meeting. So whether it's over the phone, whether it's through email, make a formal request. Send an introductory email explaining your purpose. And then again, name drop. If it's a referral, tell right, up front in the beginning who referred you. And then here's the important thing. Time frame. I'll just need 20 to 30 minutes of your time, or I just need, give them a sense of how long you think it's going to take. What happens very often is that you might say, I'm asking for 30 minutes of your time. Very often, people end up saying, well, actually, we can keep talking more. Partly because I think most people just tend to want to be helpful. And I do think there's also the element that there's nothing more intoxicating than having someone say, I think that you and what you do, I think your work is fascinating. I think you're fascinating, and tell me about yourself and what you do. People don't hear that every day. So I do think that's another reason that I think people want to talk more in informational interviews. So then you could add this if you'd be willing to have a conversation. And so then you can frame it based on what you know about that person and their schedule. Sometimes the contact is someone who isn't even in the local area at all. Sometimes they may not even be in the country. So it might even be, could I just send you a list of questions by email, or can we Skype? So basically, you'll frame it based on what you think is going to work for that situation. And then write up your interview questions ahead of time. Don't wing it. This isn't the time to kind of be off the cuff, because you're looking for really specific kinds of information. So prepare. Conduct some initial research just so that you have a basic overview. Because you don't want to walk in like an undergraduate and say, gee, tell me what this is all about and what's a typical day. You don't want to necessarily ask those basic questions that could be answered by doing a bit of preliminary research. You want to get to some of the more specific questions, but then decide what you want to focus on, organize those questions around that particular focus, and then again, learn something about that general career field, so that then you can, go on to ask more specific questions. Remember that you're the interviewer, but it's not a job interview, so it's kind of a different situation. You're really in control of this. You're the one who's framing the questions. And keep your purpose in mind, because sometimes people will go off subject or go slightly in another direction, but you might want to make sure you refocus it. So here, these are just a few questions And on our website at the Career Center at UC Berkeley, as well as I think all of the UC websites, you will find information on questions that one might ask in an informational interview. So these are some examples. What aspects of your job are the most satisfying, most challenging? So if you're hiring, what do you look for in a new hire? How do most people enter this profession? That's an important one because sometimes there are a variety of ways. I know with startups, I've done a few startup panels, and in one, it was very interesting to hear people talk about how hiring took place. One of the CEOs said, we have 20 people in our company, 16 of them knew somebody who worked here. Okay, so that's an example of how the startup world can be very, tight-knit, and so networking is actually all the more important sometimes. But it's good to get a sense of, how people do get hired. Google is in our area, and so they do hire people in the area of communications and marketing. And it's said that if you know someone at Google, and I've seen students who say, yeah, I name dropped this person, and then 2 weeks after I submitted my resume, I had an interview. Okay, so there's some companies where there's a way that maybe increases your chances of at least being seen. But those are the types of questions to ask. And then other questions like, if you were trying to break into this industry now, what would you do, or what would you advise someone to do? How is the field changing? What are some of the current issues? And then finally, this is one of the most important things to ask at the end. Is there someone else that you'd suggest that I speak to? Because again, like you're generating more ideas for contacts that could be useful. So after the interview, you want to send a thank you note, email, or else a real snail mail note, follow up with the referrals, and then keep track of contact information and follow up. Because again, remember that second purpose, which is networking. So it's not just about, gee, thanks, that was useful. It's more about, this is a person with whom I might want to stay in contact. And very often when you do an informational interview, if you hear someone who's saying to you, it's so great talking with you, please stay in touch, or please let me know if there's a way I can help in the future, or will you send me your resume? Like those kinds of signals that they really have an interest in you, potentially either, if not as a candidate, at least as someone that they might want to be helpful to, definitely follow up on it. Because very often I talk to people who get that kind of feedback that they say, yeah, but then I didn't respond, and it's been 3 weeks, so now it's too late. It's not too late. If it's been like a month, if it's been 6 weeks, it's not too late. Just follow up, because when people do express an interest like that, then that means there's a potential opportunity, whether they're going to refer you to someone else or whether they're thinking of you potentially as working with them. But basically just staying in touch. Here's the other part of the informational interview. You should always walk away from an informational interview knowing something about that person's interest. Because again, remember where your interests intersect or where there's some commonalities, those are places where you can build on those things. So if you're talking with someone and you find out that he or she has expressed an interest in knowledge sharing or innovation at work or like some topic, some emerging topic, and let's say that you're having coffee, you're flipping through the newest copy of Fast Company magazine, and you see there's a cover story on innovation in organizations. So then you could think, what a coincidence. I just had a conversation about that with this guy that I, did an informational interview with. You could do that, or you could email him and say, just ran across an article and thought of you and our conversation, thought that this might be interesting. And you may have already seen it. Whether he's seen it or not is immaterial, because when people see something like that, it makes them think of you differently. Because I think the idea that most job seekers have is, they have a job, I'm looking for a job, there's nothing I can do that would be helpful to them. But actually passing along information, that sort of thing can be useful. Even if he's seen the article, it's gonna leave an impression like, oh, okay, great. So then what you're doing is you're starting to engage, you're starting that process of saying, hey, I paid attention to what you're interested in, and I'm making that connection. Because often people don't know, well, what do I do next if they say stay in touch? So you could also just follow up on, keep them abreast of your job search and say, the informational interview we did was really helpful to me, just wanted to update you, I just accepted a job at, wherever. But that's the kind of thing that I think helps you to start establishing a network. Okay, so just to review the next steps, you want to make a courteous initial contact, keep the parameters clear in terms of how much time. Face-to-face meetings are preferable, they're not always possible. Also try to get at least one referral, try to get, several referrals if you can from each person that you talk to. Follow up and keep them informed and thank them. Okay, why should you bother? Because we know that most jobs are filled through networking. An estimated 35% of jobs that people get hired for didn't exist before they were hired, which means that sometimes people have literally talked themselves into jobs that didn't exist. Any questions? Okay. So I guess
Are there questions?
No? Okay. All right. Well, I guess we're done. Thank you. Okay.